My name is Thomas Carpenter, and I have been keeping a secret for 52 years. Not the kind of secret that eats at you, demanding to be told, but the kind that becomes part of your skeleton, supporting you even as it weighs you down. I am 79 years old now, writing this in a cabin in British Columbia that has no official address, no internet connection, and no visitors except the ones I choose to acknowledge. If you are reading these words, it means I am either dead or disappeared, and the time for silence has finally ended. It began in October of 1972. I was 27 years old, a forestry technician working for the British Columbia Ministry of Forests, assigned to conduct timber surveys in the remote regions of the Northern Rockies. The work was solitary, physically demanding, and exactly what I needed after 2 tours in Vietnam had left me unable to tolerate crowds, loud noises, or the complicated social dynamics of civilian life. In the forest, the rules were simple: respect the land, watch for bears, and document what you found. I had been working a section of old-growth forest about 60 miles northeast of Fort Nelson, an area so remote that the logging roads petered out into game trails, and those trails eventually disappeared into wilderness that might not have seen human footsteps in decades. The trees there were ancient Douglas firs and Sitka spruce that had been seedlings when Napoleon marched on Moscow. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional raven or the whisper of wind through needles hundreds of feet above my head. It was late afternoon when I found the first print. I had been marking survey points, using a compass and a chain to measure distances between specimen trees, when I noticed the track crossing a muddy depression near a creek. At first, I thought it was a bear print, deformed perhaps by the way the mud had dried. But as I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized it was unlike any bear track I had ever seen. The print was massive, easily 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes and what appeared to be a heel impression. The depth suggested significant weight, but the spacing and gait indicated bipedal locomotion. I had heard the stories, of course. Everyone who worked in the remote forests of British Columbia had heard about Sasquatch, the Wendigo, the wild men of the woods. But I had dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales that grew in proportion to isolation and loneliness. I photographed the print with my Pentax K1000, using a knife for scale, and continued my survey. Over the next hour, I found 3 more prints, all following the creek upstream toward higher elevation. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation, a deformed bear, a hoax left by another surveyor, something. But the tracks were too consistent, too natural, showing the kind of variation you would expect from an actual creature moving across different terrain. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in shades of amber and shadow, I made the decision that would change my life. Instead of returning to my truck and the relative safety of the logging camp 15 miles away, I followed the tracks. The trail led me deep into a valley I had not explored before, a place where the trees grew so thick that twilight became premature darkness. I moved carefully, my training from the war kicking in automatically. Watch your footing, scan for movement, listen for sounds that do not belong. The creek narrowed to a stream, tumbling over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow, and the prints became fresher, the edges sharp and undisturbed by wind or rain. That was when I smelled it. The same sulfurous, musky odor that Dr. Webb would describe to me years later when we finally compared notes. It was overwhelming, coating the back of my throat and making my eyes water. And beneath the smell, I heard something, a low rumbling vocalization that seemed to resonate in my chest, followed by what sounded like wood knocking against wood in a deliberate pattern. I stopped walking. Every instinct told me to retreat, to get back to the truck while I still could. But something else held me in place, a curiosity stronger than fear, a sense that I was on the edge of discovering something that would matter more than timber surveys or war memories or the small, manageable life I had built for myself. The creature stepped out from behind a massive spruce about 40 yards ahead of me. It was taller than any human I had ever seen, easily 8 feet, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb the fading light. The face was a disturbing blend of human and ape, with a pronounced brow ridge and eyes that caught the last rays of sun and reflected them back at me with an amber glow. We stared at each other across that distance, two beings equally startled by the encounter, both frozen in the moment of mutual discovery. Then it did something I did not expect. It raised one massive hand, palm forward, in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of greeting or peace. The movement was deliberate, unhurried, almost ceremonial. And in that instant, I understood that I was not facing an animal. I was facing a person, different in form but unmistakably conscious, intelligent, aware. I raised my hand in response, mirroring the gesture, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. We stood like that for perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Then the creature lowered its hand, turned, and walked away with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large, disappearing into the darkening forest as if it had never been there at all. I stood in that valley until full darkness fell, trembling with adrenaline and wonder, before finally making my way back to my truck using a flashlight that seemed laughably inadequate against the immensity of what I had just experienced. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my tent at the logging camp, the photographs from my camera spread out before me, trying to convince myself that what I had seen was real. The prints were there, documented and measurable, but the encounter itself felt dreamlike, too extraordinary to trust my own memory. By morning, I had made several decisions. First, I would not report this to my supervisors or colleagues. The ridicule would be immediate and career-ending. Second, I would continue my surveys in that area, expanding my routes to cover more ground, hoping for another encounter. And third, I would begin keeping detailed records, a journal that documented every anomaly, every sign, every piece of evidence I could gather. Over the following weeks, I found more tracks, always in remote areas far from human activity. I found what appeared to be sleeping nests, compressed vegetation and sheltered spots that showed the outline of a massive body. I found scat that was unlike anything in my field guides, containing partially digested plant matter and small bones. And twice more, I caught glimpses of the creature, always at a distance, always watching me with what seemed like cautious curiosity. By December, when snow forced an end to the survey season, I had accumulated enough evidence to fill a 3-ring binder. But I had also developed a theory, one that would have sounded insane to anyone I might have shared it with. The creature was studying me just as intently as I was studying it. The encounters felt orchestrated, as if I was being evaluated, tested for some purpose I could not yet understand. Winter in northern British Columbia is a time of darkness and cold that makes the Alaskan interior seem hospitable by comparison. I spent those months in Fort Nelson, working odd jobs and planning my return to the forest. I read everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings, Native American legends about forest giants, anthropological papers on primate behavior. Most of it was speculation or obvious fraud, but occasionally I would find accounts that rang true, descriptions that matched my own experiences too closely to be coincidence. When the snow melted in April of 1973, I was back in the forest, this time with better equipment, a 16mm movie camera, a reel-to-reel audio recorder, and a determination to document something that would prove what I had seen. I returned to the valley where I had first encountered the creature, following the creek upstream to areas I had not yet explored. The second encounter happened on a morning in late May. I had been hiking since dawn, moving quietly through a landscape transformed by spring growth, when I rounded a bend in the creek and found myself face to face with not one creature, but three. There was the large one I had seen before, which I had begun thinking of as the patriarch, and two smaller ones, juveniles perhaps, or females. They were engaged in what appeared to be fishing, using their hands to catch spawning salmon with remarkable efficiency. The sight was so domestic, so ordinary in its way, that I stood frozen, watching them work. The patriarch saw me first. It straightened up, a massive salmon still wriggling in its grip, and fixed me with that amber-eyed stare. The other two became instantly alert, moving closer to the larger creature in a clear protective formation. For a long moment, the only sound was the rush of water over rocks and the thrashing of the fish. Then the patriarch made a decision. It bit into the salmon, tearing off a large piece of flesh, and walked toward me with slow, deliberate steps. It stopped about 20 feet away, close enough that I could see the intelligence in its eyes, the scars on its arms, the careful control of its movements. It extended its arm, offering me the partially eaten fish. My hands were shaking as I raised the movie camera and began filming. The gesture was unmistakable, an offer to share food, the most basic form of social bonding known to anthropology. I set the camera on a rock, still running, and approached slowly. The creature did not move, holding the salmon steady as I came close enough to take it. The fish was warm, slick with blood and river water. I accepted it, nodding my thanks, and took a bite of the raw flesh. It was not the first time I had eaten raw fish. Survival training in Vietnam had taught me stranger meals, but it was the first time I had done so as part of a communion with something that should not exist. The patriarch made a sound, a low rumbling that might have been approval or amusement, and returned to the creek. The three of them continued fishing while I stood there, holding the salmon, watching them work. After perhaps 20 minutes, they gathered their catch and left, moving upstream with that same impossible grace, leaving me alone with a running camera and the certainty that everything I thought I knew about the world was incomplete. Thomas has crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. What happens when understanding becomes communion? Subscribe to continue this extraordinary journey. The film from that encounter became the foundation of my private archive. I had it developed at a lab in Vancouver, claiming it was wildlife footage for a personal project, and spent hours analyzing each frame. The creatures were visible for nearly 4 minutes of footage, their movements clear and unambiguous. It was proof, undeniable and documented, of something that mainstream science insisted could not exist. But I did not release the film. Something held me back, an instinct that this knowledge was dangerous, that exposure would bring consequences I could not control. Instead, I continued my work as a forestry technician, using my position to expand my survey routes into areas where encounters seemed most likely. Over the next 3 years, I developed what could only be described as a relationship with the creatures. Not friendship exactly. The gulf between our species was too vast for that, but a mutual recognition and respect. They allowed me to observe them, to document their behavior, even to participate in occasional interactions. In return, I kept their existence secret, never bringing others to the places where we met, never revealing locations in my official reports. I learned their patterns. They were nomadic within a large territory, moving with the seasons to take advantage of different food sources. In spring, they fished the salmon runs. In summer, they foraged for berries and roots in high alpine meadows. In fall, they hunted elk and deer, using coordinated tactics that suggested complex communication. Winter was spent in lower elevations, in caves and sheltered valleys where they could wait out the worst of the cold. Their social structure was matriarchal, centered around females and their offspring, with adult males maintaining looser associations. The patriarch I had first encountered appeared to be a senior male, respected but not dominant in the way I would have expected from observing apes or human societies. Decisions seemed to be made communally, through vocalizations and body language too subtle for me to fully interpret. But it was their intelligence that truly amazed me. They used tools, not just found objects, but deliberately modified implements. I watched them strip branches to use as fishing spears, crack rocks to create sharp edges for processing hides, weave grasses into crude baskets for carrying food. They had fire, or at least knowledge of it, though they seemed to use it rarely and only in the most remote locations, as if aware that smoke would attract unwanted attention. And they communicated, not just with each other, but with me. It started with simple exchanges, gestures of greeting, warnings about dangerous terrain, sharing of food. But gradually, it evolved into something more complex. They began leaving markers for me, arrangements of stones or broken branches that indicated direction or meeting places. I responded in kind, developing a crude vocabulary of symbols that allowed us to coordinate encounters. By 1975, I was spending more time with them than with my own species. My colleagues thought I had become strange, too solitary even for the standards of forest workers. I had no close friends, no romantic relationships, no life outside of my work and my secret encounters. The creatures had become my community, the forest my home, and the knowledge I carried my purpose. That was the year I first encountered others like me. His name was Robert Chun, a wildlife biologist from the University of British Columbia who had been conducting grizzly bear research in the same general region. We met by accident at a supply station in Fort Nelson, and something in his manner, a careful way of speaking, a tendency to watch the tree lean even in town, made me take a chance. Over beers in a bar empty except for us, and a bartender who had heard too many wild stories to care about one more, I told him what I had been doing. I showed him photographs, played audio recordings on a portable cassette player, described encounters in enough detail that he could tell I was either telling the truth or the most elaborate liar he had ever met. Chun listened without interruption, his expression neutral but his eyes intense. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out his own notebook, filled with sketches and observations that matched mine in every important detail. "I've been documenting them for 2 years," he said quietly. I thought I was the only one. We spent the next week comparing notes, sharing locations, discussing theories. Chen had approached the phenomenon from a different angle, trying to understand their evolutionary history and ecological niche. He believed they were a relict population of Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that had supposedly gone extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago in Asia, somehow surviving in the isolated forests of North America. I was less interested in taxonomy than in the immediate question of protection. If others knew what we knew, if word spread about their existence, what would happen? Chen shared my concerns. We had both seen what happened when humans found something rare and valuable. The creatures would be hunted, captured, studied, destroyed in the name of science or sport or simple human curiosity. We made a pact that night, the first of what would eventually become a network of observers and protectors. We would continue our research but share it only with each other and others we carefully vetted. We would use our professional positions to advocate for wilderness preservation, always citing conventional conservation reasons, never revealing the true motivation. And we would maintain absolute secrecy about specific locations, creating a buffer zone of mystery around the areas that mattered most. It was a good plan. It worked for nearly 40 years. The turning point came in 2011, though I did not recognize it as such at the time. By then, I was 66 years old, officially retired, but still spending most of my time in the forests I had never really left. The network Chun and I had started in the 1970s had grown to include nearly 50 people across North America. Biologists, forest rangers, indigenous guides, even a few sympathetic academics who understood the need for secrecy. We had developed sophisticated methods for protecting the creatures. We used our collective influence to block development projects, to establish protected areas, to create conservation easements that prevented logging and mining in critical habitats. We had diverted countless searches and expeditions through carefully planted misinformation and strategic discouragement. The legend of Sasquatch had become our ally, turning the creatures into myth rather than reality, making serious investigation seem laughable. But technology was changing faster than we could adapt. Satellite imagery, trail cameras, drones, GPS tracking, all of it was making the wilderness more transparent, harder to keep secret. Citizen scientists with sophisticated equipment were penetrating areas that had once been accessible only to professionals. Social media allowed information to spread instantly, making it impossible to contain evidence the way we had in the past. In September of 2011, a trail camera in the Cascade Mountains of Washington captured 18 seconds of footage showing 3 of the creatures crossing a logging road at night. The camera belonged to a hunter named Derek Mills, an ex-military man with enough technical knowledge to verify that the footage was genuine and enough online presence to ensure it went viral within hours of his discovery. The video was extraordinary. Unlike the grainy, ambiguous footage that had circulated for decades, this was crystal clear, shot in high-definition infrared. The creatures were visible in perfect detail: their height, their gait, their obvious intelligence and coordination. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed 7 million times. Within a week, it had attracted the attention of people we had spent decades trying to avoid. I first learned about the government's involvement from Chun, who called me on a secure line we maintained for emergencies. His voice was tight with stress. "We have a problem. The Department of the Interior has formed a special task force. They're calling it the Cryptid Species Assessment Project, buried in the budget under environmental research. But I've seen the personnel list. It's not scientists, Thomas. It's intelligence officers, military contractors, people with backgrounds in black operations." The implications were clear and terrifying. If the government was involved at this level, with this kind of personnel, they were not interested in conservation or study. They were interested in control, containment, possibly elimination. Everything we had worked for, all the years of careful protection, was at risk. Over the following months, we watched with growing alarm as the task force mobilized. They established field stations in areas we had carefully protected, brought in equipment that could detect heat signatures from miles away, deployed sensor networks that turned the forest into a surveillance grid. They were not public about their activities, but we had enough contacts in various agencies to piece together what was happening. Worse, they were effective. Within 6 months, they had mapped the creature's territories with uncomfortable accuracy, identified key travel corridors, even documented specific individuals using facial recognition software adapted for non-human features. The creatures, which had successfully hidden from human notice for thousands of years, were being cataloged and tracked like invasive species. In March of 2012, Chun disappeared. He had been in northern Idaho, monitoring a family group we had been protecting for years, when he stopped responding to our daily check-ins. A search by local authorities found his truck abandoned at a trailhead, his equipment still inside, but no sign of Chun himself. The official conclusion was that he had likely encountered a bear or fallen into a ravine, though his body was never recovered. I knew better. Chen was too experienced, too careful to have an accident. And the timing was too convenient, coming just weeks after he had sent me an encrypted email detailing evidence he had found of government facilities being constructed in the most remote parts of the Selkirk Mountains. I went into hiding. Not dramatic flight, but a gradual withdrawal from my established life. I closed my bank accounts, sold my property through intermediaries, and disappeared into the network of supporters we had spent decades building. I settled in this cabin, a place that exists on no official map, owned by a conservation organization that asks no questions and keeps no records. From here, I have watched events unfold with a mixture of horror and helplessness. The government's project expanded, incorporating new technologies and methods. The creatures, which had survived for millennia through caution and concealment, were being systematically discovered, documented, and controlled. The secret Thomas protected for decades is now in the hands of those who should never have found it. What happens next will determine the fate of an entire species. Stay with us to witness the confrontation between preservation and power. The first capture happened in August of 2013. I learned about it through a contact who worked as a civilian contractor at a Department of Defense facility in Montana. A young male had been taken alive using tranquilizers and net guns, transported to an undisclosed location, and placed in what was euphemistically called a research habitat. The news devastated me. For 40 years, I had worked to prevent exactly this outcome, and now I was witnessing the beginning of what I feared would be systematic collection. If they had taken one, they would take more. The creatures would become specimens, subjects of study, possibly weapons or tools if the military found applications for their strength and resilience. I made a decision that night, sitting in this cabin with the sounds of the forest around me and the weight of all those years pressing down. I would document everything, create a complete record of what I knew, and find a way to release it that would force public attention and hopefully public protection. The secret had failed. Secrecy itself had become the enemy, allowing the government to operate without oversight or accountability. But creating the record was dangerous. I had to be careful, had to ensure that I did not inadvertently provide information that would help them capture more creatures. The locations had to be obscured, the individuals protected even as I revealed their existence. It was a delicate balance, trying to prove something without providing a map to its discovery. I began writing in September, working from memory and from journals I had kept for 4 decades. The physical evidence, photographs, film, audio recordings, biological samples, was scattered across the country in safety deposit boxes and private collections belonging to the network members I still trusted. Some of it had already been compromised, seized in raids or routine audits that were anything but routine. The creature I had first met in 1972, the patriarch, appeared at the cabin in October. I had not seen him in years, had assumed he was likely dead given the average lifespan we had estimated for the species. But there he was, standing at the edge of the clearing in the pre-dawn darkness, his form unmistakable even after all this time. He was older, his fur grayed, his movements less fluid, but the intelligence in his eyes was undiminished. We looked at each other across that distance, and I felt the same mixture of wonder and grief that had characterized our entire relationship. I had tried to protect his kind and failed. The secret we had shared was being systematically destroyed by forces too powerful to resist. He approached the cabin, closer than he had ever come before, close enough that I could see every detail of his weathered face. Then he did something that nearly broke me. He reached out and placed one massive hand on my shoulder, the touch gentle despite his strength, and looked directly into my eyes. The communication that passed between us in that moment was not telepathic in the way Dr. Webb had described, but it was no less real. I felt his understanding, his acknowledgement of what I had tried to do. I felt his grief for those who had been taken. And I felt his resignation, the acceptance of an outcome that had always been inevitable once humans knew they existed. He released my shoulder and turned to leave. But before he disappeared into the forest, he looked back one final time, and I understood what he was telling me. Asterisk, tell the story. Let them know we existed. Do not let us disappear without witness. Asterisk. I have been writing ever since. Days turning into weeks, weeks into months, documenting 40 years of encounters and observations. The record is nearly complete now, stored in multiple formats and locations, ready to be released through channels I have carefully established. But there is more to tell, developments that have occurred even as I have been writing. The government's project has evolved in ways that go beyond simple capture and study. They have discovered something about the creatures, something that has changed the nature of their interest from scientific curiosity to urgent priority. The creatures have abilities we never fully understood, capacities that go beyond physical strength or intelligence. The telepathic communication web described is real, but it is only one aspect of something larger, a way of interacting with consciousness that has implications for neuroscience, psychology, possibly even physics. The government has recognized this potential, has begun experimenting, trying to understand and replicate these abilities. And the creatures, in response, have done something unprecedented. They have begun to fight back, not with violence. They are not by nature violent beings, but with a kind of coordinated resistance that suggests a level of organization we never suspected. Captures have become difficult, dangerous. Equipment malfunctions in ways that cannot be explained by normal technical failure. Personnel suffer psychological effects, disorientation and anxiety that makes field work nearly impossible. It is as if the species has recognized that the time for hiding is over, that they must either defend themselves or accept extinction. The war between concealment and discovery that has defined their relationship with humanity for millennia has entered its final phase. I am an old man now, watching from the margins, unable to affect the outcome, but determined to ensure that whatever happens, the truth is known. The creatures I first encountered in 1972 were not monsters or myths. They were people, different in form but not in essence, trying to survive in a world that has no room left for beings that refuse to be categorized and controlled. This is their story, and mine, and the story of everyone who tried to protect something precious that the world insisted did not exist. What happens next, whether they survive or vanish, will say more about us than about them. The patriarch has not returned since that October morning. I do not expect to see him again. But I carry the weight of his final instruction, the responsibility to ensure that when the last of them is gone, they will not disappear into silence. The winter of 2014 brought a development I had not anticipated. I received a visitor at the cabin, someone who had managed to find me despite all my precautions. Her name was Dr. Sarah Vance, and she carried credentials that identified her as a senior researcher with the Cryptid Species Assessment Project, the very organization I had been hiding from. I should have refused to speak with her. Every instinct told me to send her away, to maintain the isolation that had kept me safe. But she arrived alone, unarmed, and with an expression that suggested desperation rather than threat. Against my better judgment, I let her inside. "Mr. Carpenter," she said, settling into the chair across from me with the careful movements of someone who had been hiking for hours. "I need you to understand something before you decide whether to trust me. I did not join this project to harm these creatures. I joined it to study them, to understand them, to advocate for their protection within a system that sees them as resources to be exploited. I studied her face, looking for deception. She was in her early 40s, with the kind of weathered competence that comes from years of field work. Her eyes held something I recognized, the haunted look of someone who had seen too much and could not unsee it. "How did you find me?" I asked. "Your network isn't as secure as you think," she replied. "We've been aware of it for years, tracking communications, identifying members. But we haven't moved against most of you because, frankly, you've been doing work we couldn't accomplish ourselves. The conservation efforts, the habitat protection, the controlled management of public information, you've been more effective than any government program could be." The admission was startling in its honesty. "Then why are you capturing them? Why are you destroying everything we've built?" Vance leaned forward, her expression intense. "Because the decision was taken out of our hands. In 2012, after the Mills video went viral, elements within the intelligence community became interested, not in the creatures as a species, but in their cognitive abilities. They want to understand how the telepathic communication works, how they achieve the kind of coordination we've observed. They think it has military applications. My worst fears, confirmed by someone on the inside. The capture in Montana," I said. "What happened to him?" Her face tightened with something that looked like shame. "He's alive. They're keeping him in a facility in Nevada, trying to establish communication protocols, running cognitive tests. He's treated well, by their standards, but he's a prisoner. And they're planning to acquire more." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because it's about to get worse." Vance pulled out a folder from her backpack, laying photographs and documents on the table between us. "There's a faction within the project that believes the creatures represent a threat. They've compiled evidence of incidents where personnel have experienced psychological effects during encounters, disorientation, anxiety, even hallucinations. They're arguing that the creatures have the ability to manipulate human consciousness, that they're potentially dangerous." I looked at the documents, seeing field reports, medical evaluations, incident summaries. The pattern was clear. The government's own personnel were being affected by the same telepathic abilities they were trying to study and control. "They're pushing for a containment protocol," Vance continued. "Not just capture and study, but systematic removal. They want to relocate every creature they can find to a controlled environment, effectively putting the entire species in captivity. And those they can't capture." She paused, her voice dropping. "There's talk of elimination, framing it as a necessary response to a biological threat." The room seemed to tilt around me. Genocide, dressed up in bureaucratic language and justified by fear. When the proposal goes before the Oversight Committee in March. If it's approved, operations begin in the spring. They already have target locations identified, including several areas your network has been protecting. I sat back, feeling every one of my 69 years. For decades of work, about to be undone by people who saw the creatures as problems to be solved rather than beings with their own right to existence. "What do you want from me?" "Help me stop it," Vance said simply. "I have access to internal documents, evidence of what they're planning. But I can't release it myself without ending my career and likely facing criminal charges. You have a network, contacts in conservation organizations and media. If we can create enough public awareness, force congressional oversight, we might be able to delay the containment protocol long enough to find another solution." It was a long shot, perhaps a hopeless one. But it was something, an action I could take instead of simply documenting the end. "What kind of evidence do you have?" She pulled out a flash drive. "Everything. Budget documents showing the scope of the operations. Field reports describing captures in detail. Medical files on the specimen in Nevada. Internal communications discussing the elimination option. It's enough to cause a scandal if it's handled correctly. I took the drive, feeling the weight of what it represented. This will destroy your career. My career is already destroyed, she said bitterly. The moment I realized what this project had become, I stopped being able to participate in good conscience. I've been documenting everything, waiting for the right moment to act. Your contact reaching out to someone in my department last month, that was the opportunity one needed. The evidence is in Thomas's hands, and time is running out. Will exposure save the creatures, or will it accelerate their destruction? Subscribe to witness the battle for survival unfold. Over the following weeks, I worked with Vance to prepare the information for release. It was delicate work, requiring us to verify everything, to ensure the documents were authentic and the evidence undeniable. We brought in trusted members of the network, journalists who had covered environmental issues for decades, lawyers with experience in government accountability, activists who understood how to mobilize public opinion. The plan was to release the information simultaneously across multiple platforms in late February, just before the Oversight Committee was scheduled to vote on the containment protocol. It would be coordinated with legal action, filing suit in federal court to halt any operations until proper environmental impact assessments could be conducted. The goal was not just publicity, but legal barriers that would force the government to defend their actions in public rather than operating in secrecy. But as we worked, I continued to receive reports from the field that suggested the creatures themselves were not waiting passively for their fate to be decided. The resistance Vance had mentioned was intensifying, becoming more coordinated and more effective. In January, a team attempting to set up a monitoring station in British Columbia, my old territory, experienced what they described as a coordinated psychological assault. Equipment malfunctioned simultaneously, personnel became disoriented and paranoid, and several team members reported vivid hallucinations of being watched and judged. The operation was abandoned after 3 days, with 2 personnel requiring hospitalization for severe anxiety and 1 refusing to ever enter the forest again. Similar incidents were occurring across the Pacific Northwest. The creatures, it seemed, had decided that if they could not remain hidden, they would make themselves too dangerous to approach. The telepathic abilities we had observed but never fully understood were being weaponized, turned into a defensive strategy that exploited the very thing the government wanted to study. Vance brought me additional documents in early February, her expression troubled. They're adapting their tactics. The new protocols involve electronic countermeasures, drugs to protect personnel from psychological effects, even experimental technology designed to disrupt the creature's neural patterns. It's escalating into an arms race, and I don't think the creatures can win. I read through the documents, seeing the cold logic of military planning applied to beings who had never chosen to be enemies. The technology described was sophisticated, drawing on decades of research into consciousness manipulation and electronic warfare. If deployed, it would neutralize the creature's primary defense, leaving them vulnerable to capture or worse. We need to accelerate the timeline, I said. Release everything now, before they can implement these new protocols. Vance shook her head. We're not ready. The legal framework isn't in place, and several of our media contacts are still verifying sources. If we go early, we risk the story being dismissed as conspiracy theory or being buried by counter-narrative before it gains traction. She was right, but every day of delay increased the danger. We compromised, moving the release date up by 2 weeks to early March, accepting that it would be less coordinated but hoping it would still be effective. That was when Chun reappeared. I was alone at the cabin, Vance having returned to her position to maintain her cover, when I heard a knock at the door. It was late evening, already dark, and I approached cautiously, aware that my location was no longer as secure as I had believed. When I opened the door, I found myself staring at a ghost. Chen looked terrible. He had lost weight. His face was gaunt and scarred, and his eyes carried a haunted quality that went beyond anything I had seen before. But it was him, unmistakably alive despite having been officially dead for nearly 3 years. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. "May I come in?" I pulled him inside, my mind racing with questions. He collapsed into a chair, accepting water but refusing food, and began to speak in a voice that suggested he had been waiting a long time to tell this story. "They took me in 2012, he said. "Not killed me, took me. The government team that had been surveilling us decided I knew too much, that I was too dangerous to leave operating independently. They brought me to the same facility where they're keeping the captured creatures, made me part of their research program. Why didn't you escape? Why didn't you contact anyone?" Chen's laugh was bitter. "Escape? The facility is buried in the Nevada desert, surrounded by restricted military territory. And they made it clear that if I attempted to leave or communicate with anyone outside, they would shut down the entire network, arrest everyone we've been working with for obstruction of government operations. I was leverage, Thomas. Leverage to keep everyone else in line while they expanded their operations. What changed? The creatures," he said simply. "They're more sophisticated than we ever understood. The male they captured in Montana, the one Vance told you about, he's been communicating with others of his kind over distances we can't explain. They coordinate, share information, plan responses. And they've been studying us just as intensely as we've been studying them, learning how we think, how we organize, what we fear." Chen leaned forward, his expression intense. "They know about the containment protocol. They know about the technology being developed, and they've made a decision. If they're going to be exposed, if their existence is going to become public knowledge, it will be on their terms, not ours. They're planning something, Thomas. Something that will force the world to acknowledge them in a way that can't be ignored or suppressed." A chill ran through me. What kind of something? A revelation. They're going to emerge, multiple groups simultaneously, in locations where they can be documented by civilians with no connection to the government. They're going to make themselves undeniable, and they're timing it to coincide with your document release, to create a moment when the truth can't be contained. The implications were staggering. Everything we had worked for, the careful protection and managed secrecy, was about to be shattered by the creatures themselves. When March 15th, Chen said, 3 weeks from now, they chose the date deliberately, the Ides of March, the moment of betrayal and transformation. They have a sense of drama, Thomas. They understand symbolism and narrative in ways we're only beginning to comprehend. I sat in silence, processing what this meant. Our careful plan to control the narrative, to release information strategically, it was about to be overtaken by events we could not predict or manage. The creatures were taking control of their own story, and we would have to adapt. "There's more," Chen said, his voice dropping. "The male in Nevada, the one they've been studying, his name is Daniel. That's what he's asked us to call him, using a combination of vocalizations and telepathic communication. He's been teaching us their language, their history, things about their species we never imagined. And he's asked me to deliver a message to you specifically." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to me with trembling hands. I opened it, finding symbols I recognized from my decades of interaction with the creatures, arranged in patterns that conveyed meaning even without understanding each individual mark. The message was simple but profound. Asterisk, you kept faith. We remember. What comes next, we choose together. Asterisk. The 3 weeks before March 15th were the most intense of my life. We revised our entire strategy, coordinating with Chin's information about the creature's plans, trying to create a framework that would support their revelation rather than simply documenting it after the fact. Vance brought additional allies into the fold, carefully selected people within the government who shared her concerns about the containment protocol. We built a coalition that cut across agencies and political affiliations, united by the conviction that what was about to happen needed to be handled with wisdom rather than force. The legal team prepared emergency injunctions, ready to file the moment the creatures made themselves public. The media contacts were briefed on the broader story, given background information that would allow them to contextualize what was coming. Conservation organizations were positioned to advocate for immediate protected status under endangered species laws. But the most important work was happening in the forests and mountains where the creatures lived. Chun, who had become their liaison in a way none of us had imagined possible, traveled between remote locations, coordinating with different groups, ensuring they understood the risks and the opportunities of what they were about to do. I met with him on March 10th at a location in the Cascade Mountains, a valley I had not visited in years but remembered with perfect clarity. It was where I had first shared food with the patriarch in 1973, where the foundation of trust had been established that had guided 4 decades of interaction. The meeting was not just between us. 23 creatures emerged from the forest, representing multiple family groups from across the Pacific Northwest. It was the largest gathering I had ever witnessed, a parliament of beings who had decided that survival required visibility, that hiding had become more dangerous than exposure. The patriarch was there, so old now that he moved with difficulty, supported by younger members of his family. But his mind was sharp, his presence commanding. Through Chun, who had developed a remarkable ability to translate their communication into human language, he spoke to me directly for the first time. Thomas Carpenter, Chun translated, his voice taking on a formal quality. You have walked with us for many cycles of seasons. You have kept faith when others would have broken it. You have protected when you could have exploited. We honor this, and we ask you to stand with us as we step into the light. I struggled to find words adequate to the moment. I will stand with you. Whatever comes, however this changes things, I will continue to be your witness and your advocate. The patriarch made a sound, a deep rumbling that seemed to resonate through the valley. Chin smiled slightly. He says you were always more than witness. You were bridge, between their world and ours, between hiding and being known. And bridges carry traffic both ways. Over the next several hours, through Chin's translation and occasional direct telepathic impressions that the creatures could now project with greater control, I learned the full scope of their plan. On March 15th, 7 groups in different locations would make themselves visible to humans in circumstances that allowed for clear documentation but controlled interaction. The locations had been carefully chosen, near populated areas but in settings that minimized danger, in places with strong cell phone signals and likely presence of cameras. They would not attack, would not threaten, would simply exist and allow themselves to be seen. The shock would be enormous, the implications world-changing. But it was necessary, they believed, because the alternative was systematic imprisonment or elimination. Better to control the terms of their revelation than to wait passively for their extinction. What about Daniel? I asked Chen. The one in Nevada? Chen's expression became troubled. He's volunteered to remain where he is, to be the face and voice of his species in the negotiations that will follow. He understands that someone needs to work within the system that will inevitably be created to manage contact between our species. It's a sacrifice, giving up freedom to ensure his people have a voice in what happens next. The thought of that brave being, imprisoned but choosing to remain so for the greater good of his people, nearly broke me. We have to ensure he's treated with dignity. That all of them are moving forward. The moment of revelation approaches. Everything Thomas has protected, everything the creatures have hidden, is about to be transformed. Don't miss what happens when two worlds finally collide. Subscribe now. That's why you're here. The patriarch said through Chun. To hold humans to their better nature. To remind your species that we are people, not specimens. The laws you create, the policies you implement, the boundaries you establish. You must ensure they recognize our consciousness, our rights, our sovereignty. As dawn broke on March 11th, the creatures dispersed, returning to their territories to prepare for what was coming. Chun and I remained in the valley, sitting by a small fire, watching the sun rise over mountains that had kept these secrets for millennia. Are we doing the right thing? I asked quietly. Opening this door, changing everything? Chun was silent for a long moment. The door was already opening. The question was never whether they would be discovered, but how. This way, they have agency. They're not victims of discovery, but participants in revelation. That matters, Thomas. Agency matters. He was right, but the fear remained. Fear of what humans would do with this knowledge. How we would react to the undeniable proof that we were not alone. That consciousness and personhood existed in forms we had dismissed as legend. March 15th dawned clear and cold across the Pacific Northwest. I was positioned in a motel room in Bellingham, Washington, monitoring news feeds and coordinating with our network through encrypted communications. Vance was in Washington, D.C., ready to present evidence to congressional oversight committees the moment the creatures made themselves public. Chun was in the field, moving between locations, serving as liaison between the creatures and the human observers who had been carefully positioned. The first sighting occurred at 6:47 a.m. Pacific Time, on a hiking trail outside of Eugene, Oregon. A family group of 4 creatures allowed themselves to be filmed for nearly 3 minutes by a group of morning hikers, standing calmly while cameras recorded every detail. The footage was uploaded to social media immediately, beginning to go viral within minutes. At 7:15 a.m., a second group appeared near a scenic overlook in British Columbia, visible to dozens of tourists who captured the encounter from multiple angles. The creatures made no aggressive moves, simply observed the humans observing them, then walked calmly back into the forest. By 8:30 a.m., 5 separate encounters had been documented across Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. The internet was exploding with videos, photographs, and eyewitness accounts. News organizations were scrambling to verify the footage, bringing in experts who were forced to admit that the evidence appeared genuine. At 9 a.m., the 7th and final group made their appearance, and this one was different. They emerged not in wilderness, but on the outskirts of Olympia, Washington, near the state capitol building. And they carried signs. The signs were crude but clear, made from prepared bark and marked with symbols that had been translated into English by Chun during the planning sessions. The messages were simple and devastating. We are people. We have lived here forever. We ask for peace. Respect our home. The sight of the creatures holding signs, demonstrating like human protesters, shattered any remaining possibility that they were simply animals. This was political action, conscious choice, a demand for recognition that could not be ignored or dismissed. I watched the coverage from my motel room, tears streaming down my face, as the world I had known for 70 years transformed before my eyes. The secret was ended. The legend was proven. And everything that came next would be unprecedented. The government's response was chaotic. The Cryptid Species Assessment Project, suddenly exposed by Vance's simultaneous release of internal documents, found itself the subject of congressional inquiry and public outrage. The containment protocol was immediately suspended, though not canceled. Daniel, the creature held in Nevada, became the focus of intense debate. Was he a prisoner of war, a research subject, or a political hostage? Within 48 hours, the president had addressed the nation, confirming that an intelligent non-human species had been discovered living in North America and announcing the formation of a special commission to determine how to proceed. The UN called an emergency session. Religious leaders struggled to reconcile this revelation with their theologies. Scientists debated classification and rights. Social media exploded with every conceivable reaction from wonder to fear to denial. And through it all, the creatures maintained their dignity. They did not retreat into hiding. They did not attack or threaten. They simply continued to exist, allowing themselves to be seen, gradually expanding their interactions with humans who approached them peacefully. Chin became their official representative, the bridge he had always been between our species. He testified before Congress, translated for the creatures in carefully controlled meetings with government officials, and became the public face of an unprecedented diplomatic effort between humans and beings we were only beginning to understand. Vance was vindicated but exhausted, her whistleblowing hailed as heroic by some and condemned as treasonous by others. She joined the Special Commission, determined to ensure that policy would be based on ethics and science rather than fear and exploitation. And I, at 70 years old, found myself thrust into the role of historian and advocate, the person who had known them longest and could speak to their character with 4 decades of experience. I testified, I wrote, I spoke to anyone who would listen, always with the same message. They are people, they deserve respect, they have rights that must be recognized and protected. 3 years have passed since that March morning when the world changed. I am writing this final chapter from a new location, a research station established jointly by humans and the creatures in a remote valley that has become the first official territory recognized as belonging to them. It is not a reservation or a zoo, but sovereign land, acknowledged by international treaty as the homeland of a species that has lived here far longer than any human civilization. The process has been painful, contentious, and incomplete. There are still those who see the creatures as threats or resources, who argue for control or elimination. The containment faction within the government was not eliminated but merely checked, waiting for an opportunity to implement their protocols. Fear and prejudice remain powerful forces, but there has been progress. Daniel was released from captivity and joined the commission as an official representative of his people. A framework of rights has been established, drawing on international human rights law, but adapted for the unique circumstances of contact between species. Protected territories have been designated, areas where human activity is restricted and the creatures can live according to their own choices. The creatures themselves have been remarkably patient with the chaos their revelation caused. They understand that humans need time to adjust, to overcome centuries of assumptions about our uniqueness and superiority. They participate in the dialogues and negotiations, always through translators like Chun, always with a dignity that shames our worst impulses. I have spent these years working with a team of anthropologists and linguists, documenting the creature's language, culture, and history. What we are learning is extraordinary. They have oral traditions that span thousands of years, stories that describe the formation of mountains and the retreat of glaciers. They have philosophy and art, music created with their voices that operates on frequencies both sub- and supersonic, paintings made with natural pigments that decorate the walls of caves we are only now being permitted to see. They are not primitive. They are not lesser. They are simply different, a parallel development of consciousness that chose community over technology, concealment over conquest, harmony with their environment over transformation of it. They have much to teach us, if we are humble enough to learn. The patriarch died in the winter of 2016, surrounded by his family and honored by both his species and mine. I was there, one of a handful of humans permitted to witness the ceremony that marked his passing. Chun translated his final words, a message directed at me specifically. Thomas Carpenter walked with us when walking required courage. He kept faith when faith was costly. He stood at the bridge between worlds and chose always to build rather than burn. Let it be remembered that when the moment of choice came, there were humans who chose wisely. I carry those words with me, a benediction and a charge. The work is far from finished. The accommodation between our species is fragile, threatened by those who fear the unknown and those who seek to exploit it. But a foundation has been laid, a possibility created that did not exist before March 15, 2015. Chun continues his work as primary translator and diplomat, his facility with their language and culture unmatched by any other human. Vance leads the Research Ethics Committee, ensuring that all studies conducted on or with the creatures respect their autonomy and dignity. And I write, documenting everything, creating a record that will outlast all of us. The creatures call themselves something that translates roughly as the first people or the elder kin, a name that recognizes their long habitation of this continent and their relationship with the land. They number perhaps 2,000 individuals across North America, small family groups connected by bonds of kinship and culture, but each with their own traditions and territories. They are not mythical. They are not magical. They are real as you or I, trying to survive in a world that has become hostile to their way of life. The question before us now is not whether they exist. That question has been answered definitively, but what kind of relationship we will have with them moving forward. Will we recognize their rights as persons? Will we honor their sovereignty over the lands they have occupied for millennia? Will we learn from their example of sustainable living, their harmony with ecosystems we have devastated? Or will we repeat the patterns of colonization and exploitation that have characterized too much of human history? I am old now, nearly 80, and I will not live to see how these questions are ultimately answered. But I have hope. Hope born from having known the creatures for 50 years, having witnessed their patience and wisdom. Hope born from seeing humans like Chun and Vance choose principle over career, truth over convenience. Hope born from knowing that the story is not over, that each generation will have the opportunity to choose between our worst instincts and our better angels. The secret I kept for 40 years is now the world's knowledge. The burden I carried alone has been distributed across millions of people, each grappling with what this revelation means for their understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and our place in the natural order. And somewhere in the forests and mountains of the north, the creatures continue to live their lives, no longer hidden but not yet truly safe, waiting to see if humanity can rise to the challenge of coexistence with beings as deserving of respect and dignity as we claim for ourselves. This is my testimony. This is my witness. And this is my hope, that when the final accounting is made, when our grandchildren look back on this moment of contact between species, they will say that we chose wisely, that we built bridges instead of walls, that we recognized kinship instead of reinforcing otherness. The patriarch was right. I stood at the bridge between worlds. But I was never alone there. Chun stands there. Vance stands there. Daniel stands there. And countless others, human and creature alike, who have chosen to see possibility instead of threat, community instead of conquest. The bridge holds, and traffic moves both ways. Thomas's journey ends here, but the story of two species learning to coexist has only just begun. The world has changed forever. The question now is what we choose to do with that change. Thank you for witnessing this testimony. Share it, remember it, and let it inform how we treat the unknown and the extraordinary in our own lives. Some mysteries, once revealed, become responsibilities. Will we meet them with wisdom or with fear? The choice, as always, is ours.